Hey, this is Dr. Ben Weitz, host of the Rational Wellness Podcast. I talk to the leading health and nutrition experts and researchers in the field to bring you the latest in cutting-edge health information. Subscribe to the Rational Wellness Podcast for weekly updates. And to learn more, check out my website, drweitz.com. Thanks for joining me, and let's jump into the podcast. Hello, Rational Wellness Podcasters. For those of you who enjoy listening to our podcast, please give us a ratings and review on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to see the video version of this podcast, please go to my YouTube page. And if you go to my website, drweitz.com, you can find detailed show notes and a complete transcript. Today, I will be speaking to Dr. Peter D'Adamo, who's best known as the author of the New York Times bestselling book, Eat Right for Your Blood Type, that has launched a franchise and movement. But today, most of our discussion will not be focused on blood types. We are recording this while we're in the midst of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, and I plan to discuss with Dr. D'Adamo some integrative strategies for reducing the risks of contracting the coronavirus and for increasing the likelihood of having a minimal response if we do get infected. Dr. Peter D'Adamo is a naturopathic physician who's also an author, researcher, educator. He's considered a world expert in glycobiology, principally the ABO blood types and the secretor FUT2 polymorphisms. He's currently a distinguished professor of clinical sciences at the University of Bridgeport in Connecticut. In 1996, Dr. D'Adamo wrote the New York Times bestseller, Eat Right for Your Blood Type, followed by a long series of books on the connections between blood type and many of our nation's most serious health problems, including diabetes, cancer, arthritis, and heart disease. Dr. D'Adamo is the chief science advisor and head formulator at D'Adamo Personalized Nutrition, and he's recently been writing a series of fascinating blog posts about the current coronavirus pandemic that we will focus on today. So, Dr. D'Adamo, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Ben. It's a pleasure.
Good. So, why don't we start with perhaps, I definitely want to get into some of these fascinating blog posts you've written, as well as maybe some of the ideas you expressed in that incredible webinar you did with Drs. Brady and Lapine. But do you have any sort of overall thoughts on where we are in terms of this coronavirus pandemic right now?
Well, we're definitely at a tipping point. The question is going to be essentially how effective the strategies that people have adopted with regard to the social distancing and whether or not that can drop the infection rate down and whether or not they can get it right with regard to when they guess about the idea of being able to bring people back into society. But I think a lot of that's still optimistic. And unfortunately, I think, under the best of all the models, you're looking at something that could be like maybe middle July, but you still are not looking at things like sporting events and movie theaters and things like that. And there's actually no date that actually has been put forward for that kind of a group type thing. But I think...
And it'll probably have to be different for different parts of the country, I would think, as well.
It really does. And then, the other side is going to be the quality of the testing that is done. The antibody testing has a fairly good reliability, but put in combination with the actual PCR testing for the virus, it gets a lot better. But, you're still going to have situations where there are going to be like hotspots that are going to pop out here and there. The only thing that would be saving grace for that would be that if the numbers are low enough, you can go back to doing the contact tracing that they got wrong the first time, and then basically go and kind of do like an Ebola thing where they sort of just put a perimeter around it, get all the people and get them into quarantine, and then let that localized thing burn itself out.
Is it possible that this virus might just sort of peter out the way other viruses have? Like, I know the Spanish influenza of 1918, raged. It, kind of came in, it came in the spring. It kind of faded a little bit in the summer. The second wave was even worse. And then the following summer, it just went away and that was it. And they didn't have a vaccine or anything. And SARS kind of just sort of faded out too after about 6 months.
See, the difference with the Spanish influenza is that they got a brute force type of herd immunity because they had no real public health measures. So they just took their lumps. I mean, you had millions of people who died from that. And then after 2 or 3 rounds of exposures, you had enough herd immunity, which, it has to be, I think, about 80% of the population. And
80%. Wow.
80% population has to have a prior exposure in order for herd immunity to work. But reality is that, there are factors that can sometimes come to play. We notice that with certain viruses, they tend to attenuate over time.
What happened to the first SARS virus, that it just sort of went away?
Yeah. And there's a couple of things about this virus that gave it a kind of a special significance. We know that most people know that it attaches to the ACE2 receptor in general, although there are other slight variations to that. But one of the things that makes that so particularly significant is the virus developed what's called a furin convertase or furin cleavage convertase. It also latches onto a chemical made by the cells called furin. And that really ramps up the infectivity. That's why, for instance, it's the infectivity index is high. And it may be that something like that, which was gained kind of, surreptitiously, may be lost surreptitiously, because parasites, they really don't want to have to kill the host. I mean, my brother-in-law, in your guest room, he wants you to live, because you're giving him a free room. And so viruses typically, or most other parasites, they tend to become what they call saprophytic over time. They develop ways to not completely. Now, this might take a very long time, and by that time we might have other solutions altogether. But really, you had kind of hit the nail on the head when you did the introduction, which is, how do we modulate this in a way that the average person has the best possible chance to not have to go through the ICU and then into the whole, respiratory arrest kind of thing? And it's an interesting place that we find ourselves with the government on this, because their advice is comprised entirely of stay home until you're too sick and then go to the hospital. Now, you would think that there's acres of opportunities in that time frame to be able to do things, to basically change your odds or moderate your odds or take yourself through this process so that you get perhaps maybe a bad case of the flu and you hydrate and you take a few assistive type preparations, maybe a nutraceutical or whatever. But the government doesn't really have a plan for that because our healthcare system isn't designed to react to a new disease for which we have no cure. So, or everybody can talk about, well, this is unscientific. We don't have double-blind studies. We don't have this and that. And the truth is, you seem old enough to be able to remember the AIDS, things in the 80s. And you had ACT UP back then who were saying like, hey, a double-blind, multi-center, placebo-controlled trial is great, but I'm going to be dead by then.
Right.
So
and in fact, there's hundreds of trials going on right now with new antivirals, existing antivirals, a whole series of other drugs that been on the market for other things. And
but look at our own particular blind spot in terms of integrative type things. Sure. You go to clinicaltrials.gov and you look at the ones that were being done as a response to Wuhan, and they were all like antiviral plus vitamin C, antiviral plus traditional Chinese medicine. When was the last time anybody here said, oh, we're going to test a drug, and by the way, we'll give you some Chinese herbs to go with that too.
Right.
And so, there's just a real blind spot because we're just so locked into this model that we have to have really, really clear, concise indications that the drug is effective and that we have the indications together. But, this is an ad hoc situation. You can't just go into a situation like this with your fist clenched. You've got to open them up because, this is going to be a situation where you're going to have to just move very fast. And it's a perfect example of how we as a society, we actually stopped listening to the government at a certain point, because what the government was telling us, well, it's nothing to worry about. The risk to the American public is low. Remember Fauci saying that? The risk to the American public is low. Then the next thing we know is, masks don't work, okay? And don't waste your time with those. And these things and then all of a sudden, how are we going to get people to isolate themselves? In every one of those cases, the American public outperformed the advice of the American healthcare experts and governmental healthcare experts. The American public started thinking for themselves and saying, hey, wait a minute, you don't seem to have a handle on this. You're telling me that the virus is not going to be able to protect me from getting infected, but you seem to be neglecting the fact that an entire street full of people wearing masks has a different effect altogether. You're actually now amplifying the effect of the protective thing, because not only am I being covered myself, I'm being protected by all the other people. Well, that seemed to escape the government at a certain point, and that was they sort of had to play catch up with that. So here you have, people now, because of social media, you've got all, and here you can have an entirely different discussion, which is what kind of a fresh hell is social media right now with regard to just all the crazy ass stuff that people are actually sharing, the general low quality control of what is going out there. We had the whole thing, we were talking about this before the show started. Elderberry, who's got a theory on elderberry? It's going to give you a cytokine storm, and that's like, yeah, if only that were true. We could use elderberry as an anti-cancer agent, because if elderberry increased all those cytokines like turmeric.
Okay, so maybe you should let everybody know. So certain integrative practitioners had written some articles saying that elderberry can lead to a cytokine storm because it overstimulates the immune system, and that when COVID-19, when the infection becomes severe, you get this severe inflammatory cytokine storm in the lungs, which is why people end up having trouble breathing and end up being ventilated. And so that's the context for what you're talking about.
Yeah, and you wind up in a situation where people, again, extrapolate out. It's easy to take a Petri dish full of a couple of cells and drop a dumpster worth of a chemical on top after you've primed the cells to give you the response you were looking for. Okay? Then you contrast this with another study that actually used the substance to treat the thing in question. So you're comparing a study that says, wow, we've used this in SARS and MERS, which are the two coronavirus equivalents, and it had efficacy. And then you have Joe, new epidemiologist, molecular biologist, telling you that he found a study on PubMed that showed that it did this other thing. Now, here's a question that most people don't realize. It's also a question of amount. You can produce an increase in some inflammatory chemical in a cell culture. The question is, how much did you produce and how hard did you work to get it? Now, it turns out that the amount that elderberry produced of interleukins and cytokines was roughly about 6% of the amount that you would have produced if you ran a half marathon. So don't run any half marathons out there, folks, because your COVID is going to get worse. Especially if you're on your way to the ICU, you do not want to run a half marathon.
Right. This is similar in my mind to this fear among oncologists that taking some vitamin C is going to completely uncouple your chemotherapy, because one of the ways that chemotherapy kills cancer cells is by producing free radical reactions, and antioxidants block free radical reactions.
Yeah, except that that all started, strangely enough, not by studies, but rather letters to the editor. I can write a letter to the editor that says, I think today's Saturday, but in fact it's Tuesday.
Yeah, I specifically remember one from Dr. Watson from Watson and Crick, and he's just railing about why anybody would take antioxidants, but yet nobody has any problems with cancer patients eating fruits and vegetables, and the amount of antioxidant properties from eating a cup of blueberries is like 50,000 times what a 1,000 milligram vitamin C tablet.
Well, but let's lift the curtain a little bit on the whole Watson thing. He couldn't stand Linus Pauling because they were working. Pauling had a different model of DNA that they were in a race against. So
really?
If Pauling basically said that vitamin C was bad, I'm sure Watson would have said vitamin C was good.
I didn't know all that.
But here's another thing we have to realize is that vitamin C is it's a redox reaction, so that given the nature of how it works, vitamin C can certainly be a pro-oxidant a whole lot more than it can be an antioxidant. And then the other side of the coin is that, looking again at what are your associations? Let's talk numbers. You have a drug like cisplatin or Taxotere.
These are common chemotherapeutic agents.
Do you think that if you honestly think your multivitamin is going to, that's like saying, I'm going to put my lunch on the New Haven line and I'm going to try and derail the next train. It isn't going to happen. I mean, It's just the whole now. But even let's even discuss it from an evidence standpoint. It turns out that if you do a reasonably good study, the evidence supports the fact that actually using these very same substances seem to enhance the effect of chemotherapy, not actually blunt it. So this all became part of the standard silo type mentality that you see in most places, where this was not part of their curriculum. It's not part of their water cooler discussions. It's not part of their seminars. It's foreign information. Medicine has a one outstandingly unimpressive tendency, which is they paraphrase it as, don't be the first and don't be the last.
So you mentioned vitamin. Yeah.
So, now you could look at that and say to yourself, okay, does that mean that everybody should take vitamin C for this? No, it just means that the situation is far more complicated than an across-the-board statement.
So since you mentioned vitamin C, one of your blog posts, you explain why older folks are getting hit so much harder with COVID-19. Now, typically, flus tend to hit the older and the very young, and it's generally thought that's because they have a weaker immune system. But COVID-19 seems to spare young folks, but hits the older folks harder. But you don't think that's really because of weakness in the immune system, right?
Well, not really. I think what we do see, and there's there's a gene that's associated with the activity of, most people know by now that, the coronaviruses have a spike protein called the S protein. This interacts with a common receptor found pretty much throughout the body called ACE2. And this is part of the renin system that regulates your blood pressure. And what ACE2 does is it functions as part of a system that's involved in controlling the vasculature. And the fact that it's found so uniformly all over the body allows the body to control the vasculature in different places without having it impact other places. So it's sort of almost a kind of a set of stoplights on the vasculature this makes it very attractive. So there's a lot of antihypertensive blood pressure medicines that have been made in response to this. And it turns out that actually there is a separate gene that's related to basically the effectiveness of how well the coronavirus can interact with ACE2. And it's another gene, it's got a long name, TMPRSS2. And with this particular molecule, it shows a massive increase in the capacity of the SARS-CoV to activate it and reproduce. And it turns out that actually the molecule itself is typically controlled by a system inside the body called antioxidants response elements. So these are your natural antioxidants that you make. Okay, so we normally think, oh, vitamin E, beta-carotene, selenium. These are external antioxidants, but we make internal antioxidants that are part of our own mechanism of controlling oxidative reactions. These include things like SOD and catalase and those kind of things. But it turns out that one particular thing, which is a chemical that's called sulforaphane, but that's known to everybody else as sprouted stuff. You know,
specifically broccoli sprouts or broccoli seed extract, right?
Yes, and you can put other kind of cruciferous things in there. And sulforaphane dampens the capacity of this TRMSS2 thing to participate in ACE. But the theory that I had was that if you look at this, you see almost a perfect curve that correlates with the age-related functions. These antioxidant functions drop as we get older. So in essence, you're then basically not having the ability to dampen down this thing, which then instead of being able to go and behave itself, it now feeds into the other receptor, the ACE2, and that makes the viral replication speed up. So as you get older, your antioxidant defenses drop. Their ability to tamp the other things down becomes compromised. The virus tends to take off more. And so sulforaphanes, you can buy these things in supplements. There's and actually it turns out that sulforaphanes are just fascinating molecules in their own right. I mean, they have big effects in terms of mitigating prostate cancer. They cause your genetic material to compress again so that cancer cells don't get to read it as well as they could. It's called a histone deacetylase function. It's actually epigenetics. So you wind up with this kind of stuff and you think to yourself, wow, simple little thing, right? Go out, go buy some sprouts and do that. And again, I mean, what's the downside? There's no downside to basically increasing your consumption of sulforaphanes.
Yeah, you're the first person I've heard in numerous articles recommending specific nutraceuticals to talk about sulforaphane as being something we ought to consider adding. Obviously, eating it in your food, but for those of us like myself who believe in not only eating as many healthy nutrients from fruits and vegetables and etc., but would rather top it off with some additional supplemental amounts. This is one to add to the stack, I think.
I think so. Ultimately, you could take a lot of stuff and not get much done at all. But other than give yourself a bellyache. But I'm somebody who really feels good about taking supplements, and I think they've helped me. I'm 61, and I feel really good. I totally agree with you.
Yeah,
it's just I think when you're going to do this kind of stuff, you should work with somebody who has your type of training or my type of training, and be able to make sure that you're taking the stuff that matters.
Absolutely. If you've got to prioritize and take the things that are most important in the most appropriate dosages. Absolutely.
There's an interesting thing too, is that I've tried to sprout these things, and it's not easy. I mean, you've got some guys who do this for a living, and then you can get those amounts that are needed, but some other things are easier to get in the diet. For instance, one of the things that shows a lot of efficacy as well is green tea. Anybody can drink that. Actually it's a protease inhibitor, which is kind of interesting.
Right.
And so there's lots of other things that people can do as part of their own strategies. There's the blog has a lot of technical stuff about it, but I think what I try to do is take a step back and realize that a lot of times with the average person, they can understand something technical as long as you take a step far enough back to bring them into the story. And the other thing I believe in is that if you're actually onto something and you're actually dealing with something that's logical and science-based and truthful, it's pretty much going to boil down to a piece of common sense. And ultimately, at the end of it all, when you distill it down, somebody's going to be able to say, so in other words, you mean that. And you would say, yes, exactly. We took the long way around because I wanted you to understand how it all connected. But in essence, yes, at the end of it all, it means this.
Right. So since you did a little myth busting with the idea that elderberry is a potentially beneficial herb to take at a time like this, and that fears about creating a cytokine storm are completely unwarranted.
And you should take some vitamin D, by the way. People get problems with that.
There you go. I wanted you to comment on that. I've seen several blog posts where functional medicine practitioners have cautioned against taking vitamin D or vitamin E because they might have a negative effect in this situation.
Well, vitamin D and vitamin E we can kind of dispense with because I see no evidence that it's beneficial.
Vitamin A? But yeah, vitamin D and A they mentioned. Yeah.
A might have some slight benefit as far as mucosal immunity, but again, there's no, as far as I could find, any direct indications that it would play a role in the mechanistic basis or the mechanism behind this whole thing.
Right.
Vitamin D, on the other hand, there are things called sins of omission. You know what they are? They're like, you made a sin because you left something out. And then there's what are called sins of misrepresentation. Now, your sin was that you just got the whole thing wrong. And it turns out that if you ask me, sins of misrepresentation are worse than sins of omission. It goes back to what my third grade nun said. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. Okay? So the reality here is that you have really the worst of all possible types of things. When people take a hypothetical and use that in a fearful population, a population that's looking for things to confirm fears, then you're kind of, in a way, you're stunting how we can basically take hold of this. Vitamin D is a perfect example. It has some indications that, it possibly might be, I don't know, what was the counter argument there, that there was some increase in, I've seen it increases vascular endothelial factors and all sorts.
Yeah, they were saying it might increase the expression of the ACE2 receptors.
Yeah, well, it turns out that actually by a factor of fill in the blank, the ACE2 receptor is ubiquitous in the body. So how are you going to increase this, receptor all that much when it's basically found everywhere to start off with? The second problem with this is theoretically, you're looking at saying that, but then what does the literature say? It's clear. People who are vitamin D deficient have a much higher rate of progressing to ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. That's the thing that kills you with COVID-19. So by being vitamin D deficient, there's a clear link to the progression of the thing that kills you. So here's the hypothetical. Here's the actual. All right? Yeah, and you can't compare the two.
Right.
And it turns out that what do you define as a vitamin D deficiency? Well, those people might say a number that's maybe below 25. But I would say vitamin D deficiency to me is a number below 50. So in many respects, and then look, how many people get vitamin D? They put on sunblock like it's an extra set of clothing. They never go outside.
And they're taking statin medications to drive their cholesterol lower, which is how your body makes the vitamin D.
And they take 4 baths a day. And so there's never any stuff on the skin to get converted in the first place. So, the reality is that, how do you respond to somebody who's just made that degree of misrepresentation? You just try it. And this, of course,
so the bottom line is, vitamin D is a super healthy nutrient to take at all times, that we probably ought to strive to get our vitamin D levels up to a range of, say, for example, 50 to 70 nanograms per milliliter, not just above the minimal of, say, 25 or 30. And especially in a situation like this, it actually has absolute beneficial effects in preventing this ARDS, which is how people die. And there's also quite a bit of data showing that if patients do end up on a ventilator, if they have higher levels of vitamin D, they'll do much better and survive.
Right. And, there's another study that I put up on the Facebook group that showed that actually higher levels of vitamin D were protective against cytokine storms.
Right.
So, I mean, what are you going to do? Take somebody who's been playing with their Legos in their mind and take their word for it? Or you're going to go look at the science and see where the direct connections are?
Right. So I want to come to this blog post you wrote about chloroquine, zinc, and quercetin. What do you think about this chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, which, some people are touting, some people are skeptical of? I've seen functional medicine doctors recommending it for like everybody as part of their protocol, or even using quinine water. What's the truth about chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, which traditionally has been used for malaria?
Right. And the drug, which has been around forever, is Plaquenil, which people take for lupus and some autoimmune diseases, and it's cheap as all hell. And chloroquine phosphate is one of the WHO essential medicines. It's considered to be one of a small number of medicines that the production cost is so cheap that it's considered to be mandatory for all the participants to keep that, because we live in a malarial world. So, to step back, chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine are what are known as quinine analogs, that they come from the same family as quinine, which is the Jesuit bark that was found in the cinchona tree that was the first official treatment for malaria. And yes, people have felt that this was an indication that they should drink lots of tonic water, because since it is a quinine analog, maybe if I drink tonic water, I'll have the same effect. And quinine may very well act in a manner similar to the other drugs, because there is some evidence that it does. The difficulty is thinking that you could get anywhere near a dose sufficient by drinking tonic water, because by government law, your tonic water can only have a maximum of 83 milligrams of quinine per liter. And to get up at a therapeutic dose, you would need maybe about 600 to 800 milligrams. So you'd have to drink about 10 liters a day of tonic water.
Which nobody's going to do.
And, that's a lot of gin. So, the reality is that, would it have somewhat of an effect? Well, I don't know. But the mechanism is, we understand that there's a lot of politics caught up in this drug, because the administration kind of jumped the gun on it and kind of started promulgating for it. But mechanistically, we understand it does work in certain areas that would certainly be interesting and possibly effective. It tends to cause an alkaline reaction in places in the cell where the virus reproduces itself. And they're like little blebules called endosomes. And inside those endosomes, the virus actually is convincing the cell to make more virus. But those endosomes require very low pH, a very acidic environment. And most of these chloroquine quinine drugs raise the pH in those.
So just to clarify for 1 second, the virus with the spike protein attaches to the ACE2 receptor, then it gets into the cell and it ends up in one of these endosomes first, right?
Yeah, after basically, well, the first thing it does is an RNA virus. So it goes into the body of the cell, the cytoplasm, and convinces the ribosomes, which are the things that make proteins, to make a few virus proteins. And then those virus proteins set up the next stage, which is to make a new virus. And that takes place generally they have to find a way out of the cell once they get made. So they kind of make a bubble, and then that bubble heads towards the outside and fuses outside and releases the virus.
Oh, okay. So that's the endosome. Okay.
So basically that has to be very acidic, because the virus is going through a finishing school in terms of its proteins. It's getting carbohydrates glommed on it to make what are called glycoproteins and things. As soon as you raise the pH, that comes to a halt. And we know that the class of drugs that are the chloroquines, they caused an alkalinization of the endosome. So there's a mechanistic aspect there as well. But there's another thing there that actually implies that there may be an even second mechanism about why these things work, and that has to do with what are known as zinc ionophores. Generally, zinc is very critical to the cell, but it can cause a lot of disruption. So the cell likes to keep the zinc outside. And zinc has an electrical charge that makes it very difficult for it to penetrate the cell. So the body has to produce what's called an ionophore, which is almost like a little gate that causes the zinc to come into the cell. And they know that actually when the zinc concentration rises inside the cell, the capacity of the virus to manufacture copies of itself by using the protein machinery, reading its RNA, it goes down to zero. But we can't get enough zinc inside the cell by itself because the body has a built-in mechanism to prohibit that. So you have other chemicals that actually act to open up those gates. Those are called zinc ionophores, and chloroquine is one of those. So there's a second mechanism behind how it could possibly work, but it also points the way to a natural product that does the same exact thing, which is a bioflavin called quercetin, which people take for allergies and stuff.
Right.
So you can look at how you could kind of hot rod. For instance, let's say, I was telling somebody the other day that actually there's I don't want to get too into the woods here, but there's a very famous, powerful Chinese herb called Chinese scute, Scutellaria bicalensis. It's called Chinese skullcap. Use it a lot in cancer management. Wonderful plant and well studied. You could go into PubMed. There's hundreds of articles on this plant because two ingredients are really, really profoundly powerful: bicolin and woganin. We won't go there. But it turns out that Chinese scute has the effect of actually doing that same thing to the endosome that chloroquine does. So in essence, if you can't get your hands on any chloroquine or quinine, you could actually make your own cocktail of quercetin and Chinese scute, and you would have both of those functions covered by those two.
Wow, cool. How much zinc do you think we should probably be taking per day?
Well, it's a great question because it turns out that you don't really have to take any extra zinc because most of us have fairly adequate levels of zinc in our bloodstream. But a little background probably wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. Eat a couple of oysters or take a 15 milligram zinc or whatever, 20 milligram. I don't like high doses of zinc because it just starts messing up other stuff. But, and also too, it's interesting because it'll stay in your bloodstream for quite a while. So even if you took it like 50 milligrams of zinc every couple of days, that would be sufficient because there's plenty of it out there. In most of us, but
yeah, I know somebody like me. I traditionally have tested low on zinc, and genetically I have a couple of genes that make it difficult for my body to absorb zinc. So
that would be a good reason to basically add a little.
I've normally been adding zinc, and it made a huge difference in several other things going on. So.
Yeah, so you have that basically and again, there's very little downside to taking the lower end of the spectrum on zinc supplementation, especially in the short term. Okay?
Right.
So what you're doing is you're kind of working the equation. You're kind of saying, okay, I want to control for this variable too. In other words, I don't want to leave that to chance.
And what would be a good dosage for the Scutellaria to take?
Good question. I can tell you, I take a couple of. I think the capsules are 500 milligrams, but they're just the herb. They're not anything special. I take a couple of a day.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting thing too because you can do a whole show on Chinese scute in terms of its biochemistry and applications and things. But again, another harmless. Good anti-inflammatory herb, very good for cancer stuff. Wonderful when given concurrently with chemotherapy because it acts to induce apoptosis. And so it kind of finishes the job that the chemotherapy is doing.
Cool. So we've been talking about how older folks are more vulnerable, and you wrote another blog post about melatonin and its potential benefits here. Maybe you can talk about that.
Sure. Well, melatonin is something a lot of people use to go to sleep. And you have to pardon me if we get a little technical here, but, that whole process of going down the road of massive inflammatory consequences and end stage see COVID-19, it's all due to rampaging inflammation. And that's courtesy of a very primitive part of our immune system that regulates chemicals that are known as inflammasomes. And we think of our immune system essentially as based, I get an antibody, I'm protected, that's called acquired immunity or adaptive immunity. But we also have a very primitive part of our immune system that actually we share with lizards and all sorts of very primitive organisms. In other words, it's been so good, they keep it around. So that actually you get to even the higher organisms and they still haven't found a reliable replacement. So we still got this same thing. And what it is it's called innate immunity. And the mechanism behind it is that it's kind of like it's kind of a shoot first, ask questions later type immunity. And ultimately the reason being that it's set up to give you protection, because you see all those other types of adaptive immunity, they require time in order for you to become sensitized, in order for those lymphocytes to promulgate and clone off, in order for them to make antibodies. There's a temporal element there that sometimes back when you're running through the jungle and you cut your foot on a rock, you don't have 2.5 weeks to do that. So there's this primitive immune system that has like circulating battery acid. And what happens is when it recognizes certain patterns that tell it that something bad has invaded the body, it activates these like clusters of things, and then they release all these corrosive enzymes. So this is called an inflammasome, and then the big one is NLRP3, which is the functional inflammasome involved in things like cytokine storms and a lot of the inflammatory stuff. And, well, I mean, it's a very effective, if somewhat unprecise system. It's one of the ways you can certainly wind up with your immune system going quite recklessly on you. So the evidence suggests that melatonin tends to damp this down. It tends to actually keep NLRP3 levels low, and that tends to somewhat decrease the odds that you'll go into any sort of an advanced inflammatory, blowout kind of thing. The nice part about it is that, who was the guy who said, was it Newton? He says an object in motion is able to be maintained in motion with a minimal amount of effort. It turns out that extraordinarily low doses of melatonin keep this thing happy. So it isn't even like the amounts that anybody would have to take anything. That sometimes the amounts that the amounts that people take to go to sleep are probably overkill. But it turns out that a couple of milligrams of melatonin actually, again, and I would fit that with vitamin D. These are the things you can do to remove variability and risk out of any progression to anything other than just a bad flu. In other words, you want to stay out of the ICU. That's right. The whole strategy.
Right.
You can be miserable at home.
On the other hand, potentially higher dosages like 20 to 40 milligrams could potentially be beneficial if that cytokine storm had already started and you are in the ICU. So it'd be interesting for somebody to do a study of those patients with a higher dose of melatonin. Obviously, that's not something the person's going to be doing while they're on a ventilator, but
right. And of course, there's that whole hospital culture thing again, which is, you can't even get people sometimes to sign off to do some vitamin C and stuff. It's a whole rigmarole.
Now, aren't some of the hospitals doing IV vitamin C?
Yes. And certainly some of the protocols for chloroquine that are being used in the hospital are including zinc.
Right. Okay.
So, there are little changes here and there. I think, it's kind of like, again, it's really about being resourceful, being able to make the best possible decisions at the best possible time. I wrote a blog about another herb called stinging nettle. And some of your listeners probably take stinging nettle because it's used a lot for allergies and stuff, the leaves.
Yeah, I recommend it for men who have elevated levels of sex hormone binding globulin.
That's precisely why the root is used, because ultimately in the root
that's
is something that actually drops your
SHBG.
Yeah, there you go. I'm not good with consonants. I don't know if you noticed that. But, the reality is that there turns out to be a chemical inside the root of stinging nettle known as a lectin. And lectins are little molecular pieces of Velcro that actually fly around and interact with things. And sometimes they interact with things for the worse, but every occasionally, if you get the condition and the lectin right, they can actually do some good. And it turns out that there's a lectin in stinging nettle that actually interacts directly with the connection between the ACE2 receptor and the viral spike protein. And there's studies on this. Matter of fact, someone told me after reading my blog, you might be interested to know that NIH is extraordinarily interested in stinging nettle lectin right now.
Wow.
Which also brings up another interesting thing, which will get me to yet another interesting thing.
And of course, lectins have been in the functional medicine world by a prominent doctor who's been telling everybody not to eat grains and beans and seeds and even any fruit or vegetable that has seeds because they contain lectins, which are necessarily bad.
Yeah, but if he would have read my book, which I'm sure he did, he could have learned that most of these things are blood type specific. So, of course, we have another conversation there.
Right.
The interesting thing about stinging nettle, though, is actually you don't have to have a lot. The root is, people can go out and pick it, or you can take the supplement. There's another interesting lectin as well, which actually is worth also talking about here, and it has to do with the lectin found in leeks. Leeks are, my wife is going to make some leek soup today. They studied all these lectins that had capacity to interact with SARS. They don't have evidence on COVID-19, so they use MERS and they use the prior SARS or other coronaviruses. And the lectin from leek has a fairly profound inhibitory effect, again, on the capacity of the viral spike antigen to actually bond to the ACE2 receptor. And it's very abundant in the part you make the soup from, which is the stalk, the bulb part. There's another thing. Lectins are actually very similar to, in structure, to the area that I've spent most of my life studying, which are blood groups. You look at, like, for instance, remember from bio class, certain blood groups cannot get blood from other people. Okay, so for instance, I'm blood type A, I can't get blood from blood type B. Blood type B can't get blood from blood type A. Blood type O can only get blood from blood type O, and blood type AB can get blood from everybody, universal receiver. Well, it turns out that those antibodies that you make to the other blood types are one of the prime reasons we probably have blood types to this day. Why hadn't they ever kind of merged together? It's because they convey a sort of built-in protection against pandemics. If you have an antibody against blood type B because you're blood type A, and the pandemic virus looks like blood type B, you're protected. So that nature sort of hedged its bets by making these antibodies specific. And it turns out you can't find an infectious disease that doesn't have a predilection for one blood type or another. And it turns out that the studies that have been up that were sort of got widely distributed was that, for instance, blood group A had much more of a tendency to have a severe case of COVID-19. Again, this has been actually shown again in a separate study in the United States. So the Chinese observation was duplicated. But one thing that they didn't pay attention to was that there were prior studies on the earlier versions of coronavirus that actually told us why this was the case. It turns out that the reason type O is better protected against coronavirus from consequential type damage and severe ARDS is that they make an antibody to blood type A, and it's the antibody to blood type A that gives them the protection, and it's the inability to make an antibody to blood type A, which is what gives the risk to people who are blood type A. You can't make an antibody to yourself. So It turns out that I wrote a blog and I said, well, even though you're blood type A and you can't make an antibody to A, you can use certain foods that contain anti-A-like lectins. For instance, soybeans, fava beans, domestic mushrooms. These foods will actually act in a kind of a replacement way for the antibody that you can't make because your system won't do it. So Again, hypothetical, but all based in very, very sound molecular biology. And we know these lectins get passed right through your gut. They do all sorts of interesting things, and away we go. So you have that, you have the leek lectin, you have the stinging nettle lectin. These are like naturally occurring targeted monoclonal antibodies. You just have to know where they go, who they react with, and how to get them in there.
What would you think would be a reasonable dose of taking stinging nettle root?
I'm
thinking it typically is coming in like 250 milligram capsules, what I've seen.
Yeah, it's hard to say what the actual dose is, because I actually ran some numbers on that and came to something like you needed 17 grams.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but before I totally alienate the audience, it turns out that that's not the way they calculate. In other words, I was extrapolating out the amount from small animal studies and in vitro studies, and it turns out that you just don't simply multiply the amount by the difference in weight. So
right.
It turns out that probably along the lines of about maybe a gram a day of the root would be. But here's the interesting thing.
Which is typically, I'm usually recommending 500 milligrams twice a day. So that would.
Yeah. And the other thing about lectins, which makes them so fascinating, is, actually makes them why they killed that guy with ricin back in the 70s, is the lectins disassociate after they do their damage. So, for instance, after a lectin gloms onto a sugar molecule, it initiates a phenomenon on the cell that's called capping. It causes all the receptors to move to like the north pole of the cell. And once they get all coalesced there, the lectins disassociate and they're free to do it all over again. So actually, it turns out that this is not a straightforward, you need this amount in order to do this, because once you get them going, they just keep doing it again. They just attach and release, attach and release, attach and release.
Fascinating. Good. So, so to kind of sum up what we've talked about, we talked about why older folks are more vulnerable, and it probably has to do with their weakened antioxidant defenses, and so therefore antioxidants, including sulforaphane, potentially would be beneficial. I definitely think that vitamin C, right? Do you recommend vitamin C as a preventative for?
I take 4 grams a day.
Right. Yeah. So you take 500 or 1,000 at a time. Do you think it matters how much to take?
I take like 2 or 3 in the morning and 2 or 3 in the second dose later in the day.
Oh, 2 to 3 grams.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not gonna say that these numbers are absolute.
Right.
I have to say though, since I've been taking it, my gums have never been happier.
Yeah, I normally take 2 grams of vitamin C a day, and now I've upped it to like 6 to 8, basically every couple hours. I usually take some vitamin C and then take some of the immune strengthening herbs like elderberry, echinacea, and then periodically throughout the day throw in some zinc and quercetin and resveratrol. Resveratrol seems to be another nutrient that may have some benefit here.
It may. I mean, ultimately, it has similar actions in many ways to quercetin.
Right, and also may help to protect the heart. And I guess there's a percentage of patients who end up with myocarditis from coronavirus infection. Yeah.
Now, if I was an emergency room guy, I would put a little taurine in the bag.
Taurine, yeah. Throw some IV glutathione or NAC in there.
Yeah, well, certainly taurine, because there's good literature that taurine basically. What happens is when you go through a myocarditis event, there's something called a free amino acid pool in heart muscle. It's like a motor pool in the army. It's a bunch of cars anybody could use, and it turns out that if you look at the free amino acid pool in cardiac muscle, taurine is number 1. And number 2 is 1.5 miles away. So there's just
Wow.
so much the myocardial tissue loves to just have extra levels of taurine. And so if you look at things like enlarged hearts and kind of things like that, it's very effective for that kind of stuff. So if I was in a situation where I was looking at myocarditis as a possibility, well, that would be something. But again, these are types of things that, they're not going to penetrate hospital culture in the short term.
Right. Probably coenzyme Q10 wouldn't be a bad idea either, which I understand also helps with zinc transport.
Yeah. And there's actually one of the clinical trials.gov is looking at coenzyme Q10 with a few other things. So we'll see.
Yeah, interesting. And also antioxidant status there. So sulforaphane, we talked about why elderberry is potentially beneficial and not a problem. Zinc with quercetin, and we talked about melatonin. You talked about maybe a couple of milligrams. I think typically a lot of the dosages are 3 milligrams. That would probably be fine, right, before bed.
That's what you talked about my time with Todd, but actually Todd and I were talking about that, and David, and they were like, hey, you don't need a lot of that stuff in order to get this effect.
Right. Yeah. And if you're stressed out and getting a little help with sleep wouldn't be a bad idea either.
Sure. There are other things that you can use to control inflammasome activity, and most of those things are kind of like a little more esoteric. Another one I think I kind of keeping my eye on is arabinogalactan, which actually has some interesting properties as well, large arabinogalactan. There was some studies that showed that people who had gotten a BCG vaccine seemed to have some resistance to advancement of the advance. Well, it turns out that if you look at what BCG vaccine is, a vaccine against tuberculosis. And it turns out that what it is the vaccine. The vaccine is created out of the viral membrane. It turns out that the viral membrane is made out of two chemicals. One of them is teichoic acid. The other one is arabinogalactan. So ultimately, arabinogalactan may give you an immunological step up that's very similar to what they're seeing in people who get the repeated BCG vaccine.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, I typically take a mixture of herbs that includes that, except these days it's hard to get your hands on supplies of it. Everybody's
I got supply chain issues here. I get one of these days. I'll tell you how I got started in large, because up until the moment that a 50-pound bag of it showed up in my clinic, nobody in our functional medicine, naturopathic medicine, ever heard of this stuff. It was used mostly as a substitute for gum arabic, and was manufactured by a paper company who wanted to have it used to glue the back of envelopes.
Wow.
And then, so at one point, I get a 50-pound bag, shows up in my office with a bunch of articles in Japanese that just go like Japanese, echinacea, Japanese, arabinogalactan, and a phone number. So, and it was a guy at the Champion Paper Company. He sends me this bag of stuff, and I said, what did you send me this for? Well, he goes, we know you do a little bit of stuff with the immune system, and you're kind of well-versed in this kind of stuff. I said, so it's good for the immune system? He goes, well, I can't really say that, So what they did is they gave me this huge amount of stuff, and I just started passing it out to people. Works great for otitis media and a few other things. And
really?
It's a real common nutraceutical, but that if I didn't get that 50-pound bag of large, nobody'd be using it.
That's great. I think that's a wrap for here. That was an incredible discussion of some of the interesting mechanisms from an integrated perspective.
It was very enjoyable, and thank you for asking me. I enjoyed our chat very much.
I did too. And so for those listening, watching, who'd like to get a hold of you and get your books or contact you for consultations, how would they get a hold of you and your products and your books?
I think they can go to didamo.com, which is my mega website. If they want to read the COVID-19 blogs.
Yeah, those are hard to find.
Yeah, if they go to the main page, there's an orange bar at the top, and it says, click here to read Dr. D'Adamo's COVID posts.
Ah, okay.
So they can go to it's my last name minus the apostrophe, DADAMO.com.
Right.
And you can read all things blood type, but then also all the COVID stuff is there. And, I've since been mostly doing genetic stuff. I write a lot of software now, so I don't really see that many patients anymore. I mostly see my old patients.
Okay.
But I do have a telemedicine practice that I do with other doctors that do use my software and stuff. And they can go to, I think it's thedamohousecall.com.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
Right.
Thanks, Doc.
You're quite welcome. It was nice chatting with you. Be safe, and maybe I'll pass across physically one of these days in the new system to come.
Sounds good.
Take care now.